The 75 years old NATO alliance is now set to undergo a major transformation. US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has called European countries free riders and introduced a new plan called NATO 3.0. A 6-month ultimatum has reportedly begun to either increase defense spending or face a reduction of American military support. In simple terms, Europe can no longer rely entirely on the United States and must be prepared to take greater responsibility of its own defenses. But why is America changing its approach? How NATO betrayed Trump's expectation during the Middle Eastern crisis? And how NATO 3.0 is the US last chance for revival of the NATO group? We will discuss everything in today's episode. Hello and welcome to your global analytical show, The Strategist. I'm Shreya and let's get started. American NATO 3.0 plan isn't something out of the blue. The United States now views Russia as a regional threat but considers China the only global rival capable of challenging American economic, technological, and military power. Washington wants to focus its military strength and strategic attention on containing China in the Indo-Pacific region. American policymakers believe that the US cannot effectively fight two major strategic rivals simultaneously, Russia in Europe and China in Asia. Under the concept of NATO 3.0, the United States wants Europe to take primary responsibility for European security. Countries such as Germany, France, and the United Kingdom are expected to strengthen their own militaries and take the lead in deterring Russia. This would allow America to deploy more aircraft carriers, submarines, and advanced weapon systems in the Asia-Pacific region. China's increasingly assertive actions in the South China Sea and around Taiwan are viewed by many Western strategists as one of the most significant challenges to the current international order. A substantial portion of global trade passes through these waters. If China were to gain control over Taiwan, it would have enormous influence over global semiconductor production and critical maritime trade routes, potentially creating major strategic and economic consequences for Western nations. China now possesses the world's largest naval fleet by number of vessels and continues expanding its military presence across Africa, the Middle East, and the Pacific. For the United States, countering this expansion has become a top strategic priority, and reducing the burden of European security commitment is seen as an important part of that effort. Now let's turn the clock towards 1949 and examine NATO 1.0. When NATO first appeared in the world stage, what circumstances led to its creation? The answer to that is we need to revisit a period when the world was rapidly divided into two competing camps. In 1945, after World War II had ended, Europe was devastated. Economies were shattered, cities lay in ruins, and populations were traumatized by years of conflict. Western European countries such as Britain and France felt that they could not defend themselves alone. They needed a powerful ally to guarantee their security. That's when, in April 4th, 1949, 12 countries signed the Washington Treaty, creating the NATO. The alliance was based on a simple principle: collective defense. An attack on one member would be considered an attack on all the other members, and all would respond together. The original 12 members were the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Italy, Portugal, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland. But who was the perceived threat back then? The Soviet Union or the USSR? Although the United States and the Soviet Union had been allies against Nazi Germany during World War II, their ideological differences quickly resurfaced after the war. America championed capitalism while the Soviet Union promoted communism. The Soviet Union gradually established control over the Eastern European countries such as Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia. Communist governments emerged across the region. Western nations feared that Soviet influence and military power would continue spreading throughout Europe. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously described this division as the Iron Curtain, a metaphorical barrier separating Eastern and Western Europe. Throughout the Cold War, NATO's primary mission was deterrence rather than direct warfare. NATO never fought a direct war against the Soviet Union. Instead, its purpose was to contain Soviet expansion and convince Moscow that any attack on Western Europe would trigger a massive response, including American nuclear capabilities. NATO experienced major crises during this period, including the Berlin crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet invasion of Hungary, and the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. Yet, despite these tensions, NATO and the Warsaw Pact never fought a direct war. As NATO's first Secretary General, Lord Ismay, famously joked that NATO's purpose was to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. In short, NATO 1.0 had one central mission: containing the Soviet Union and preserving peace in Europe. It largely succeeded as the Soviet Union ultimately collapsed in 1991. But however, NATO did not disappear with the Soviet Union. Instead, it entered a new phase known as NATO 2.0. Many believe NATO should have been dissolved alongside the Warsaw Pact, but instead it entered its most fascinating and controversial phase. Even with the USSR gone and the US and its allies felt that the world remained unsafe. They feared instability in the newly independent states, and Russia still possesses thousands of nuclear warheads. More importantly, NATO had evolved beyond a mere military alliance. It was now the primary vehicle of sustaining American influence in Europe. Instead of shutting down, NATO changed its mission statement. Our job is no longer just defending borders, but spreading peace and democracy across Europe. NATO began absorbing countries that were once Soviet allies or territories: Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, later Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Slovenia nations directly bordering Russia all joined NATO. This triggered a massive historical dispute that lies at the root of today's Russia-Ukraine crisis. NATO 2.0 has evolved into an aggressive, expansionist global player. It pulled Russia's old neighbor into its orbit and staged military interventions worldwide. However, this overreach set the stage for the modern conflicts. A resurgent Russia refused to tolerate encirclement, and its strategic alliance with China has reached a point where NATO must now prepare to confront both powerhouses simultaneously. During the 1990s, a weakened Russia remained silent. But geopolitics changes. In 2000, Vladimir Putin took power in Russia, reshaping global affairs and laying the groundwork for NATO 3.0, an era defined by the return of the old villain with an aggressive new posture. Putin wasn't initially anti-NATO. He even floated the idea of Russia joining the alliance at one point. However, this stance hardened as NATO consistently brushed off Moscow's security concern. The breaking point arrived in 2007 when Munich Security Conference, where Putin openly challenged US and NATO hegemony, declaring NATO expansion a direct provocation that Russia will no longer tolerate. Ignoring the warning, NATO declared in 2008 that Ukraine and Georgia would eventually become NATO members. For Moscow, this crossed a vital red line. Viewing the integration of Ukraine and Georgia into NATO as an existential threat, Russia took immediate military action. The 2008 invasion of Georgia and the 2014 annexation of Crimea. These actions signaled that Russia would use force to halt NATO's advance. Then came 2022, when Ukraine codified its ambition to join NATO into constitution. Putin launched a full-scale invasion. The world had fractured back into two distinct blocs, NATO and the West on one side and Russia backed by China on the other. The goal of NATO 3.0 is to contain both adversaries simultaneously. Though geographically tied to Europe and North America, NATO 3.0 is rapidly formalizing partners with four key Asia-Pacific democracies: Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, collectively known as the IP4. NATO is actively expanding intelligence sharing, cyber defenses, coordination, and joint military exercises with these nations. If China attempts a military misadventure in Taiwan or South China Sea, it will face the unified global network rather than just the United States. Furthermore, China's challenge to the West spans technology as much as military hardware. A massive component of NATO 3.0 is countering the grey zone warfare. NATO nations are tightening restrictions to block the transfer of sensitive technologies such as artificial intelligence, semiconductor, and 5G to China, while banning Chinese investment in critical European infrastructure like ports and telecommunication networks. This is designed to starve the PLA of advanced Western tech and stall its modernization. Finally, in response to the surge in Chinese cyber operations targeting allied government portals and defense infrastructure, NATO 3.0 has expanded the interpretation of Article 5 collective defense to encompass severe cyber attack and space-based satellite threats. A major digital assault on member state will now trigger a coordinated alliance-wide digital and economic retaliation. As a final symbolic indicator of this systematic pivot, the United States has recently renamed its Indo-Pacific Command back to the Pacific Command, solidifying its position as a central component in the architecture of NATO 3.0. How effective is this NATO 3.0 will be in its vision will be something worth seeing. We will bring you all the updates, and that is it for today's video. If you liked it, don't forget to like, share, subscribe. I'm Shreya signing off.